Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion today about academic freedom and free speech on campus here with the Society for the Rule of Law. My name is Gregg Nunziata. I'm the Executive Director of the Society, and I'm really glad to be hosting this program today. I have with me Professor Keith Whittington of Yale Law School, who's an expert on these issues, and I look forward to our conversation starting in a few minutes. Just before we get into the substance of it and I begin speaking with Professor Whittington, I wanted to tell you all a little bit about who we are in case you're new to the Society's programming. The Society for the Rule of Law is a group made up primarily of right of center, conservative, libertarian lawyers and interested citizens who are interested in the defense of and the study of the Constitution, the rule of law, and American democratic values. And they prioritize that study and the defense of those values above short-term partisan concerns. We really try to focus on enduring principles that make America work. If that sounds appealing to you, we would love you to join us. We're a membership organization. All the work we do is made possible by our members. So if you would consider a membership, I invite you to get on our website, the societyfortheruleoflaw.org. There's a link for membership, which we will drop into the chat here today. So you can do that. There are several levels of membership for lawyers and non-lawyers, students, and more. So please give that some consideration. While I'm talking about our website, we also have an initiative that we launched a few weeks ago, which is a statement of principles concerning the rule of law, which we think every American citizen should be enthusiastic to support, and we invite you to do so. We've now had over 1,700 attorneys, law students, judges, and citizens sign on to this statement of principles. We'll drop the link for that in the chat as well. We will get to our conversation with Professor Whittington in a moment now, and we are going to use the basis of this talk, this excellent new book that Keith has just published called You Can't Teach That, The Battle Over University Classrooms. And I will love to talk with Keith about kind of what led him to write this book, what he's hoped to accomplish, and have some kind of broader conversation about academic freedom and free speech. After Keith and I have spoken for a bit, I will invite some audience questions. We're going to have the best way to submit questions is to drop them in the chat box, which is open now, and I'll keep an eye on it, and I can weave them into our conversation, particularly at the end of our time today. One other thing to mention, this presentation is recorded, as all of our programming is. Our webinars and our in-person programming is recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. If you follow our website or follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, you can find these recordings. Interesting one just last week was with Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute about restoring constitutional values and making our system of government work. It was a really terrific conversation. It's available for you to see there on YouTube. We do programming like this on a pretty regular clip. I'm going to take a few weeks off for August, and we'll be back with more webinars in September. So take a look on our website for that. And in November, I wanted to mention also, we will be having our second annual summit. We haven't announced a specific date yet, but I expect we'll be doing that on our website within a matter of days. And that'll be in Washington, D.C. In mid-November. Similar to our summit last year, but it'll be a larger crowd and expanded programming. So I'm really excited and hope you all will join us in person for that as well. Now, Professor Whittington, let's talk about your book. It's a great read. It's slim and it's certainly a legal book which discusses Supreme Court precedent, but it also discusses kind of broad themes of academic freedom, how the First Amendment works on campus, particularly public universities. And I think it's accessible to non-lawyers. But if you could just give us a quick introduction to what the book is, why you wrote it, what you hope to accomplish with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues and obviously the book as well. A few years ago, I wrote a book on principles of campus free speech more generally called Speak Freely, which sort of helped get me involved in thinking about campus free speech issues across the board, whether we're talking about student protest or outside speakers or faculty speech issues. Over the last few years, I've been particularly heavily involved in thinking about faculty speech issues and academic freedom issues, in part through work in an organization I helped found, the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is organized to defend academic freedom principles in American universities. And unfortunately, I think we've seen sort of increasing number of threats to academic freedom from a wide range of sources over the last few years. And so it's really called more attention to these issues. This book is focused specifically on problems of freedom of teaching in American colleges, and particularly around legislative interventions in university level teaching in public universities. So that's one part of traditional academic freedom principles in the United States. Those principles historically have included, in addition to teaching, also have included issues of scholarship and writing and publishing scholarly work without outside intervention, as well as the ability of faculty to engage in public speech on political issues and social issues more generally. But the threat to teaching has been particularly prominent and raises a lot of thorny conceptual issues, which is part of why I wanted to write the book, is really try to think through what those principles are, what are both the history and principles and rationale for freedom of teaching at the university level, but also how does that relate to First Amendment doctrine as it's been developed in the 20th century relating to academic freedom. And does that have particular implications for things like Florida's Stop Woke Act and other kinds of legislative proposals and bills that have been under consideration or passed in many state legislatures, and I think are going to continue to be on the agenda for several more years to come. So the book tries to think about both what the traditional principles are in the United States relating to teaching, how we all think about the implications of those principles and why we have them, and then try to think about the constitutional issues specifically that are associated with those principles, and what the potential applications are of those to some of the current legislation and policy that's under debate.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think maybe a good place to start our conversation is to ask the questions, what is academic freedom and where does it come from? And we have universities have existed since the Middle Ages, and often under control of prominent, powerful states or the church. Academic freedom is a more recent notion, certainly in the American context. What is what are the main precepts of academic freedom as we understand it, and how do they come to be?
Yeah, so academic freedom, as we understand it now, sort of was imported into the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in part from, and especially from Germany, which was really a leader in developing academic freedom and free inquiry principles in the 19th century. And moreover, was the place where the world's leading universities were. And so there were a large number of American scholars who went to Germany for advanced academic training in the late 19th century. They came back to the United States with PhDs in hand and with experience in those German universities. And among the things that they experienced there and that they brought back with them to the United States were these principles of academic freedom that were being talked about there. And they started to try to advocate for them in the American context as well. And this primarily came initially through advocacy by professors themselves trying to persuade universities to voluntarily adopt principles of academic freedom. This came primarily through the formation and organization of the American Association of University Professors, which was an advocacy group of university professors, which was formed in the early 20th century. And over the first few decades of its existence, was quite successful ultimately in persuading universities both to adopt some kind of tenure system, so it'd be harder to fire faculty, that their faculty could only be fired for cause, and the set of causes for which they could be fired would be relatively limited. And to get universities to adopt, as a matter of internal policy, a set of commitments that they would guarantee to faculty freedom to teach, including teaching controversial ideas and materials without outside intervention. And the outside intervention that the AUP was most concerned with was the problem of boards of trustees and university professors and university presidents who would fire professors who were doing something controversial on campus. And sometimes they'd be responding to more outside pressure, so political pressure, community pressure, alumni pressure, donors, and the like. But the mechanism through which professors were punished historically, both in public and private universities, was through university presidents. And so really, the original goal was, how do we tie the hands of university presidents so they wouldn't fire faculty for doing something controversial? And some of that controversial stuff was what they would teach in the classroom. The second prong was relating to scholarship. So would they publish controversial scholarly tracks of various sorts, and could the university censor that material or punish faculty for their scholarly activities? And then finally, their free speech activities more generally. Could faculty talk about politics and social issues in public without facing repercussions from their universities? And all three of those principles were ultimately adopted as a matter of contract in most universities to some degree or another. And then in the mid-20th century, the U.S. Supreme Court started talking about some of that, at least, as also having some constitutional foundations when it comes to public universities. In particular, they're actually bound by the First Amendment, which raises the question then, do you have to rely only on contracts, or are there also some constitutional constraints that backstop some of these contractual guarantees?
So then, well, first, do you have any? There's some stories in the book about early battles on campus? Were there any ones that were favorites of yours that you discovered in researching this book that were like illustrative of the principles or the change that was going on in American higher education a century ago?
Yeah, there are a lot, and they're interesting, and the book does try to talk some about that sort of early history, in part to illuminate why we should care about these issues at all. One thing I don't think I fully appreciated was the extent to which battles over human evolution were really central to a lot of conflicts over teaching, specifically in universities, both public universities and private universities, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there was less debate about the idea of evolution in general as a scientific theory that applied to the animal kingdom. But once you started trying to apply it to humans as a biological issue, but also as it carried over into social Darwinism and issues of sociology and other social systems and analogies to Darwinism, there was quite a lot of controversy. And not just at religious universities and not just in the South, although those controversies were common there, but really at universities across the country. And professors were being fired over this, state legislatures were becoming involved, trustees were becoming involved in these teaching issues. Eventually that fades away. But it helped galvanizes university professors and create a lot of media attention on what was happening in universities and whether or not professors are going to be free to teach controversial topics that might offend students, might offend the local community, might offend parents in various ways. And of course, evolution was just one topic. There were lots of subjects that could get professors in hot water. Teaching economic and political issues were a traditional source of concern for lots of professors. And that I was more familiar with, but I was a little more surprised by just how extensive the debates over human evolution were, not just in things like the Scopes monkey trial, which we're familiar with and thinking about K through 12, but also the extent to which it was affecting universities also.
Yeah, well, there's some of this idea that the schools or universities have this broader societal mission, and that they, we talk about them having this quasi parental role over students, and maybe they're supposed to be doing some forming of character. Certainly, many of our schools were founded to
Yeah.
educate future ministers, or they have this mission. And after the evolution battles in the book, you talk a bit about the Red Scares, so the around World War One, and then after World War Two during the Cold War, where there's a big public concern about subversive ideas, communism in particular, and whether academics are pushing these ideas on campus. One little moment in the book that I did not know or had forgotten was Eisenhower's tenure at Columbia University, and how he thought about this before becoming president. So you talk a little bit about the anti-communism in this story, and I think this starts to bring us closer to the law stuff, which I promised to get
Yeah,
to.
absolutely. Yeah. Eisenhower, not primarily remembered as a university president, but he did briefly serve as a university president before running for the president of the country. And when he left Columbia, he gave this farewell address in which part of what he talked about was sort of warning Columbia to keep communists out of the university, and told the story about when he took over the university. He'd been warned that universities were filled with communists, and he was really concerned about what he would need to do to try to root them out. And happily, he thought he had found that universities were not nearly as bad as people were saying on the outside. So it was not as big of a problem as he feared it might be. But he thought that having communists in university faculties would be a big problem in a Cold War context, and was something universities ought to be very sensitive about and cared for. And it was a huge issue really throughout the early part of the 20th century and into the mid 20th century, but comes to a head there in the 1950s and 1960s. Over the influence of communist in university teaching. It divides faculties as to how to think about the threat of communists. You have political interventions into universities requiring loyalty oaths and other things, not only in the university context, but of course in lots of other public employment context more generally. But they wind up connecting up to these academic freedom concerns in an educational context, both actually in K through 12 context, but also in university context as well, and raises real questions about what kind of freedom should faculty have, both in public and in private universities, to participate in political activities they believe in, including advocating for socialist and communist causes. What kind of freedom should they have in the classroom to engage in teaching, including teaching that might be affected by their belief in socialism or communism, for example. And again, to a lesser degree, what kind of research should they engage in? Like I said, faculty were genuinely divided about how big of a concern it should be about the possibility of communists being on the faculty. Some university faculty thought that communists could not, in good conscience, be true scholars because they were committed to parroting the party line, whatever the party line might happen to be. And so they weren't really searching for the truth. They weren't really giving their honest opinions. They were just
And
telling
that seems like a
what
distinct,
Moscow would say.
like two maybe distinct criticisms or arguments, which maybe even have somewhat different responses or legal responses. I mean, one,
Yeah.
this idea that we want to keep out subversive ideas
Yeah.
or free thinkers who might
Right.
think their way to the left, versus we want to keep out folks who are following a party line and aren't really engaged in the search for truth. They're agents of a international political movement,
Right.
taking orders, which is something that had not really occurred to me. But those are distinct problems.
Those are distinct problems, and really there's a transformation that occurs. The debates in the early part of the 20th century about socialism broadly are really about subversive ideas as such, and sort of a worry on the part of donors and alumni and parents and the like, that you shouldn't have professors advocating for socialism in university campuses, because those are subversive and bad ideas, and universities should reject them, just like they should reject human evolution and various other things that donors were concerned about at various points in time. The communism concerns, though, the mid 20th century really did start tying into Cold War concerns and the particular organization of the Communist Party. And so there were still concerns about sort of radical ideas being taught, but there were much greater and more specific concerns about members of the Communist Party and how they would behave in a university, and were they themselves a subversive force within the university in ways that might damage national security in this kind of context. And anti-communist academics like Sidney Hook were very prominent in making these arguments that a loyal communist could not actually be a legitimate academic, and really had no place in a university, couldn't shelter themselves under traditional academic freedom concerns. And so there became real issues about, okay, even if you thought that was true, how do you tease these things apart? How do you maintain protections for academic freedom while just identifying and separating out these people who were not being good faith academics, which poses real challenges in practice, but also gave rise, as you suggested, just to some constitutional law, then trying to think about it, because these were both touching on sort of traditional First Amendment concerns as the court's rethinking the nature of free speech, but also involving a lot more governmental intervention than what we were seeing in earlier debates over what was happening in universities. The government was actively involved in these problems of rooting out communists in public universities in particular.
Yeah, so the academic freedom concerns cut across academia generally, but some of the First Amendment arguments are specific to public universities, correct?
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the law, and I think you organized this well in the book, but a couple of the big questions that maybe a common citizen would have on these issues. Um, don't university professors work for the government, and shouldn't the government be able to tell its employees how to conduct the performance of their duties?
Yeah, it's a real, I think, a hard question. I think a lot of professors would like to think it's an easy question, but I think it's a genuinely quite hard question. And it's at the root of these academic freedom debates from the very beginning, right? Because a lot of trustees have the same attitude about private universities. That you hire professors, and those professors work for the university. And from the perspective of a lot of trustees, then the professors should be professing the ideas the trustees believe in. And that was the traditional notion in the United States. As you said, a lot of universities in the United States started off as training ministers, and part of the job of trustees was to make sure professors were teaching the right doctrines to those ministers that you were training. Maintaining a kind of dogmatism and orthodoxy within university teaching was an important value in universities as they were originally formed in the United States. And so part of what's being transformed in the late 19th and early 20th century is that idea of what a university even is. And when you have this new mission emerging, that initially is a bunch of secular universities, including a lot of public universities, but eventually older private universities like Yale and Princeton and others come on board with the same ideas, you start imagining what universities are in the United States are advancing knowledge. They're exploring new ideas. And if that's what you're doing, then having the trustees imposing orthodoxy and discipline doesn't work anymore. You need to give professors the freedom to explore those ideas and seek the truth as best they can. And by the mid 20th century, that had become a fairly well accepted understanding of what universities were doing, and especially public universities. And so you had this somewhat odd situation in which universities were established, whether they were established by private entities or public entities, but they would hire faculty without the goal of saying we're going to tell those faculty what to say. Instead, we're going to hire experts in the field and we're going to let them explore the ideas as best they can, even if they wind up exploring a bunch of ideas that we, as the people who created the university or govern the university, think are radically mistaken. And that might be true about religious doctrine, but that also might be true about political and economic doctrines, like socialism and the like. And under current circumstances, it may well be true of things like critical race theory. Where the argument is, look, you hire faculty not to teach an orthodoxy that the legislature has imposed on the university. That's not what universities in the United States are for, but instead you hire university professors to explore ideas as best they can, and that may include ideas the legislatures find quite disturbing or wrong, but nonetheless, you've created a kind of independence for universities. The constitutional, and that's been sort of true in practice in terms of how universities have operated in general, although certainly with some real imperfections about how that's played out over time. So, for example, Southern governments during the Jim Crow era were quite interventionist in universities to make sure that universities did not talk too much about racial desegregation and attack Jim Crow during that period. And likewise, of course, the Cold War period put some real pressure on these ideas. But at least in general, there was an understanding that even public universities had some real political independence from legislatures, from politicized board trustees in their academic and scholarly work. And the Warren Court started exploring in the late 1960s the extent to which there was a constitutional foundation for that, were state legislatures required to keep something of a hands-off attitude when it came to faculty, even in their public universities, even though these were government employees performing governmental functions in a university context. And it's not conceptually easy to work out how that constitutional logic works and what are the appropriate boundaries of it, because clearly legislatures have some role to play relative to state universities. And so they can't be completely hands-off. And so as we've seen in lots of other contexts where we try to think about, okay, how do you establish independence from government officials, whether we're talking about the Department of Justice and the Attorney General having some independence from the president, or we're talking about the Federal Reserve Board having some independence from the president or from Congress. Likewise, there's a real challenge about how do you make universities quasi-independent from state legislatures or other government officials while recognizing that they're still part of the government.
So I'm going to actually jump ahead to an audience question because it's relevant to where we are right now. We had a question asking if you could explain to us the Garcetti case and what its implications are for academic free speech. Now, forgive me if I'm forgetting, but this is not an academic case, right? It's a case about a prosecutor's office.
Yeah.
So why does this matter? Why is it such an important case and that you discuss at length in this book?
Yeah, so the court winds up articulating some ideas of academic freedom coming out of some of these Cold War loyalty oath type cases, but it doesn't say much more about that, except to say there is a First Amendment interest in academic freedom, but then doesn't give a lot of guidance about how that's actually going to work in practice. Then subsequently, the court winds up developing what gets known as government employee speech doctrine. So what kind of speech rights, what kind of First Amendment rights do government employees enjoy working in governmental offices? And of course, the traditional answer was none at all. And the court instead says, no, it turns out that they do have some speech right protections. Some of that relates to their speech out of the workplace. And this rises in the Pickering case involving a high school teacher who wrote a letter to a local newspaper and then was fired for it because the school board didn't like the content because he was opposing some school board policies in that public letter. And the court says, well, look, even government employees like teachers have rights to participate in the public sphere unless it interferes with their job duties in some concrete and very specific way, which has huge implications for government employees across the board, including, of course, university professors. But then that raises the question, well, what about the kind of speech that occurs in the government workplace itself? And the court works through this in a few later cases, culminating in Garcetti. And so Garcetti involved, as you said, a prosecutor's office, and in that context, a memo that was written in a prosecutor's office in which a lawyer suffered adverse employment consequences for the memos he was writing in the government's office. And the court says in that context, well, look, you have a First Amendment right to participate in public activities, but you don't have an unrestricted First Amendment right in what you do in the workplace itself. And in particular, Garcetti says, when you're engaged in speech that is a function of your employment duties, like writing memos, legal memos, if you're a lawyer in a prosecutor's office, then of course, workplace supervisors can manage that speech, and including disciplining you for that speech in various kinds of ways. But the court says as well, look, this could have big implications for academic freedom, and we're going to set that aside. So we're not going to talk about here what implications this might have for scholarly work by academics, whether in their teaching or in their research. So this is sometimes characterized as a Garcetti exception for academic freedom, and a lot of lower courts have understood that as being an exception, that the university context is carved out as not being under the Garcetti rule. Some lower courts have said, well, this isn't really an exception. The court just hasn't reached the question yet. And really the logic of Garcetti ought to extend into a university context as well. And of course, if Garcetti does extend to a university context, then we're done in terms of academic freedom protections for teaching. Because when you're in a classroom teaching in a public university, you're performing your governmental duties in that context. And if you can be punished for that speech that you engage in the classroom, then one of those core features of academic freedom simply wouldn't apply in a university context, except to the extent, in a public university context, except to the extent that the public university had voluntarily allowed it to apply in that context, but there wouldn't be any First Amendment basis for it. And so part of the issue at stake in the current litigation over the Stop Woke Act is whether there is actually a Garcetti exception that allows for academic freedom. And Florida is arguing that there should not be, that the government should be able to control any speech that occurs in a university classroom from a university employee. And if they don't like what professors are saying in the classroom, they should be able to fire those professors, as well as other lesser consequences for those professors in those contexts. And there should be no First Amendment constraints on the ability of state governments to take those kinds of actions.
So then the other big argument that they make is that, I don't know, by establishing or funding state universities, the state is speaking in a manner, right? The state can set a curriculum, and that's the government's expressive content, which has its own body of law. So how does discuss what that argument is, and then sort of how the courts have handled it, or
yeah. So the court also, post the academic freedom case, has developed this so-called government speech doctrine, in which the court has said when the government itself is speaking, there are no First Amendment constraints on that. So government can pick and choose what messages it wants to convey through its own channels of communication. The kind of obvious things are the government decides to adopt a no littering campaign. It can say, don't mess with Texas, please don't litter, and it can choose to express that particular message if it wants to. And then, of course, when the government speaks, it has to speak through employees or through other media that it has contracted for this purpose, whether it's signage or a communications person or the like. And so then the question is, well, look, if you have teachers in a classroom, are they basically expressing the governmental message? Are they hired for the purpose of expressing the governmental message? Then, of course, the government can tell them what they ought to say. And then, of course, the government can punish them if they say the wrong stuff in that context. And in fact, we tend to basically treat K through 12 teachers and public schools in that way. That we think they're hired to convey a government message. The government has a very detailed curriculum. We expect teachers to follow it. And there's very limited, I think, First Amendment rights for school teachers to say, I can depart from the government's message and teach an alternative curriculum or teach ideas the government doesn't approve of in a K through 12 context. And then the question is, again, are public universities different in this regard? Are public university professors different in this regard? Are they more like K through 12 teachers that they're employed in order to convey the government's curriculum and convey the government's message? Or are they employed to do something different? And so one thing I try to do in the book is both lay out what the government speech doctrine is, what kind of framework the court has provided in order to understand when the government's speaking and when is the government not speaking, which is often complex. The courts often have struggled to some degree. And one of the things it's really concerned with is try to tease out, okay, is this an instance of government speech, in which case the government can come in with a heavy hand and really tell people, stop saying this, we don't want you to say it? Or is this an instance of private speech, in which case we shouldn't confuse it with government speech and we should keep the government out of censoring or controlling that kind of speech? And I argue that given those frameworks the court's given us, university professors in public universities are best understood as private actors in this sense, and they're not government spokesmen conveying a governmental message, but instead they're employed to convey their own private messages, in which case they ought to get some First Amendment protections, and the government can't simply come in and say, we expect you to toe the party line in the classroom. At least they can't do that without dramatically remaking what universities are. Which
I was just about to ask you that because you touched on that. I thought it was sort of an interesting hypothetical. I mean, you say a lot of this analysis rests on our contemporary understanding of what a university is and what and academic freedom it requires. But what if, Florida or Texas decided to go a new direction with a higher education that really had as its organizing mission forming the perfect Texan or whatever that might be? How would we think of it differently? I mean, I imagine we think about military academies differently than other universities. They've got I don't know, and you could correct me, but I don't recall if it came up in the book. But I don't think there's terrific First Amendment concerns about the government's control over how military academies work, but maybe there is. So
I don't talk about military academies in the book, but they are an interesting example from this regard. So traditionally, military academies did not recognize academic freedom precisely because they thought that they were not performing the same kind of function that universities do in general. University professors in military academies do not perform the same function as universities do in general, including state universities. And so as a consequence, there was a lot more top-down direction about what ought to be happening in the classrooms. Very recently, the military academies have adopted voluntarily some academic freedom principles to protect both scholarship and teaching for faculty in the military academies, but there's some real boundaries there. They're much more restrictive than what we'd see on most university campuses. And I think the First Amendment protections you'd expect to enjoy as an instructor at West Point would look pretty different than what you'd expect someplace else. But in order to understand those differences, I think that's right. You have to think about the nature of the institution that's been established and what work it's performing. And so likewise, when we think about state universities, the question is, well, what's the nature of this institution as it exists today? And what kind of work is it performing? And as a consequence, do those who are operating within those institutions, does it make sense for them to enjoy fairly robust First Amendment protections in that context? But I think that's a pretty contingent feature of those institutions. And you could imagine states making conscious decisions to abandon that model and move to something very different, in which case they could create institutions or modify their existing institutions in ways where it doesn't make sense anymore for faculty to say, well, look, I've got First Amendment protections to convey my own message. It'd be possible for the university to say, for the state to say, no, universities really are just governmental institutions conveying a governmental message. I don't think that's how we think about universities right now. I don't think even Florida really thinks about its universities like that right now. But you could imagine a world in which they did operate in that form. There are other countries in the world that do operate their universities in that form. And if that's the kind of university a state wanted to establish, I think it's within their constitutional authority to do that. I just don't think they've done it right now.
Is there, I think, the Stop Woke Act seems to be, or legislation like it, responding to the teaching of critical race theory and similar concepts, do seem to be picking a side and having a particularly ideological view. Um, are there more general ways that a legislature could shape the content of instruction, such as, um, a part of the purpose of our state university system is to form citizens, and the curriculum needs to uphold liberal values, inculcate liberal values, not necessarily outcome specific, but something along these lines, which is less, sort of less partisan, more general, more tied to the public interest, or is it just impossible to
No, I
approach
think
this?
there are various ways of doing it within the confines even of how we imagine universities existing now without wholly transforming them into just governmental propaganda machines. Um, but you could imagine, for example, carving out parts of the university or particular classes in the university and saying, okay, the university in general is fairly autonomous from the state. But these particular classes are extensions of the state, and this is where you're going to go and get the governmental message, and you can hear a non-governmental message in the classroom next door, for example, that's doing something else.
But
I
you
think
think you could require a mandatory class in citizenship designed by the state of Florida? Uh,
I think you could, and you could hire faculty specifically with the idea that they would teach that governmental message, and if they don't want to teach that government message, you could replace them and have other faculty members who could do it. I think that there are interesting questions which there's really basically no constitutional doctrine relating to, and really not much in the way of principles historically developed in the United States. But you sometimes hear the notion of academic freedom of students. And so there are questions about can a student, for example, be forced to take a civics class with a particular message at a state university? And I think that probably the answer is yes, but it's new ground, and the court has not given any real guidance to that particularly. There would be some complications there that would have to be worked through, but I think there'd be options. And we've seen some states actually sort of take more interest in thinking about the nature of the curriculum, especially the sort of core curriculum, general education requirements of universities. And so in Florida, for example, they've now said they don't want sociology to be part of the general ed requirements of the state. In North Carolina, they just adopted a policy requiring a kind of civics class as part of the general ed requirements, and moreover, requiring that certain materials be taught in those classes, the U.S. Constitution, Gettysburg Address, that kind of stuff has to be taught. Part of what's different about the North Carolina requirement, for example, is it doesn't tell instructors how they have to teach the material. So if I wanted to teach it with a critical race theory spin on the Constitution, there's nothing in the North Carolina requirements that say I can't do that. And so I could teach a pretty critical version of the U.S. Constitution. I just have to teach about the U.S. Constitution. Part of what's different about the Stop Woke Act and some of these other kinds of legislation modeled along those lines is it says if you're going to teach a given topic, you're not allowed to teach it from these perspectives. And so it has a kind of viewpoint discrimination attached to it, which is particularly disfavored under the First Amendment. And so I think is particularly tough to defend unless you make the kind of radical moves that Florida is now making of saying, well, we get to make viewpoint specific determinations if it's government speech, for example. And
but
so,
sometimes,
but that's different than what you see in places like North Carolina or Texas has had a longstanding requirement that students at their state universities take a class on the American government, for example. Again, doesn't have any specific requirements about what exactly gets taught about the American government or from what perspective or what kind of opinions or ideas get expressed. But you have to learn something about the American government. And that's much more open-ended and much more easy to defend given existing First Amendment doctrine.
I have a bunch more questions for you, but just wanted to remind the audience that they're welcome to submit any questions they have in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as I can. Um, Advocates of legislation like this, trying to respond to critical race theory and other perceived radical and divisive teaching on campus. Um, Sometimes they talk about the ideas being dangerous, but sometimes they specifically talk about indoctrination,
Yeah.
which may be again a different argument and maybe have different legal consequences. How do you assess those claims that professors are indoctrinating students?
Well, I think you're right that indoctrination has become a big talking point on these issues, and the argument's often tightly related between sort of claims about indoctrination and claims about this particular subversive ideas that are being taught. And I think indoctrination is a real can of worms, very hard to think through, and in part because indoctrination is not very well defined. People have all kinds of different ideas about what they mean when they talk about indoctrination. Sometimes it merely means exposing students to ideas that you don't like, but sometimes it means other things that are more specific. And part of why ideas about indoctrination, I think, are complicated in this regard is traditional academic freedom protections have always excluded the idea. So from its very foundations, the American Association of University Professors have said professors ought to have the freedom to teach in their classrooms, but they have to teach in a professional way. And that specifically excludes indoctrination. The AUP has never been very specific about what it has in mind by indoctrination. It's never really defined the terms very specifically either. But at least in principle, there's some kinds of things professors might do in the classroom. They're outside the bounds of traditional academic freedom protections, and we might also think are outside the bounds of traditional First Amendment protections as well. It's challenging, I think, to develop a statute that identifies indoctrination and targets it specifically in order to punish faculty for it. But I think it's possible to do it. And moreover, I think if you can do it, I think the implementation issues are really hard. But if you can manage to do it, I think there is a path there that is consistent with traditional academic freedom principles, and I think consistent with the First Amendment as well. And I think there's a lesson there for faculty that they ought to be more self-conscious than they often are about what professional teaching ought to look like in university context, and how and why they ought to be avoiding anything that looks like indoctrination. So among the things that have traditionally been pointed to as being like indoctrination are you don't allow students to explore alternative ideas in the classroom. You don't allow criticisms of ideas in the classroom. The professor has a favored set of ideas. They want the students to absorb those ideas. They won't allow criticisms of those ideas. They won't allow students to voice criticisms of those ideas or explore criticisms of ideas or read criticisms of those ideas. That's traditionally understood as kind of indoctrination and inappropriate for university professors to engage in. I have no doubt there are university professors who engage in that kind of behavior in the classroom. Again, I think hard to root it out in practice. But there's, I think, no traditional academic freedom protections for engaging in that kind of thing. And likewise, I think there's all kinds of activities that are kind of adjacent to that that run into similar kinds of concerns. So, for example, if you require students to participate in specific political activities, you tell them they have to go participate in a pro-choice rally, for example, or you tell them they have to go participate in a pro-Palestinian rally. That likewise, I think, runs afoul of these kinds of indoctrination concerns, and professors, I think, can be appropriately punished for mandating that their students engage in those specific kinds of political activities. On the other hand, if you tell students, go participate in a rally as part of the activities in the class, if it's educationally relevant to the class that you're teaching, and you're not specifying what positions they have to take or what specific things they have to do, I think that's appropriate and consistent with what a professor can professionally expect students to do. And there's no reasonable complaint for students to make to say, well, now you're trying to indoctrinate me when you've told me I need to go participate in a political rally, despite the fact it can be on whatever topic or issue or from whatever perspective I might prefer to engage in.
So let me just shifting the lens a little bit. One of the kind of longstanding concerns from the right about academia is not just that there are some subversives on the faculty, but that the faculty is overwhelmingly to the left of center.
Yeah.
Tons of polling that would seem to suggest that and the kind of the flip take from the right is that if you really cared about academic freedom, there'd be a lot more diversity
Yeah.
of views amongst the faculty, and there's either by design or inertia some groupthink that is taking over. I guess first, how do you weigh that criticism? And then secondly, at least with respect to public universities, is there a public policy response that policymakers could consider that would promote intellectual diversity while respecting constitutional limits?
Yeah. So I've written about this separately. Don't talk about it in this particular book, but I think it's a real concern. And it ought to be a real concern to those who care about free inquiry on college campuses, as well as those who care about the political viability of universities. So frankly, even if we thought in practice and that a politically lopsided faculty can do their jobs perfectly well, and there's no real scholarly or educational consequences to having a very lopsided faculty, I think we still ought to be concerned that politically that's not going to be very, very sustainable. You can't go off into the state of Florida, for example, and tell them, don't worry, I know this is a very conservative state with conservative politicians and conservative populace, but our faculty are 90% on the left, and you shouldn't worry about that. That's not going to breed trust and respect and support for universities. So I think universities have gotten themselves into a bad situation just simply from that kind of perspective. But I think worse than that, it does have consequences for the educational mission and scholarly mission of the university. I think there's not a lot of evidence that left-wing professors are particularly inclined to abuse their positions and engage in indoctrination, for example. But I think it's certainly the case that there are research questions that we don't explore or take seriously simply because there's a lot of groupthink among faculty. There are potential criticisms of assumed ideas that go unexplored because there's no one who sincerely believes them. And so ideas, I think, are that ought to receive more criticism or not adequately criticized. Ideas that ought to be explored more are not adequately explored. And that affects both the teaching side of universities and it affects the research side of universities. And universities would be better off from their own scholarly perspective if they had a more ideologically, politically diverse faculty. It is, I think, a tricky problem, though, as to how to solve this. And it's a severe problem in part because the pipeline is extremely thin. And so it'd be one thing if there were lots of conservative PhDs out there that you could easily hire and start making them faculty. The problem is there just aren't. There's not a lot of conservatives in graduate school seeking PhDs. There are good questions about why that's the case. I think in part it's a problem of they perceive they're going to be discriminated against in academia, and so they don't pursue those careers.
My faculty advisor is an undergrad political science major, told me not to think about going to graduate school for poli-sci because I would not be able to get hired with my views.
Yeah, I think this can be overstated, but it's a real phenomenon. It's a genuine concern. I've seen it, I've experienced it, and so I don't discount explicit discrimination in how universities operate. But I don't think it's the only explanation as to why we don't have more conservative faculty. But it's left us with a quite severe pipeline problem, and that is a real one and will not be quickly or easily solved, even if the universities were really committed to trying to solve this problem, which they tend not to be. I do think some of the interventions that we're seeing by state legislatures in quite a few states of trying to add new centers and institutes and colleges. They're sometimes characterized as sort of civics or statesmanship centers and the like. Can be a useful vehicle for trying to diversify the faculty along these lines. We'll see how those play out. But I think those can be done in a manner that's consistent with how universities ought to operate, and could lead to some real improvements on those university campuses in general, and could affect academia more broadly. So I'm cautiously optimistic about those kinds of interventions, at least. But I think we ought to be somewhat modest about what we can expect, and including we ought to be somewhat slow about how they developed in recognizing this pipeline problem. One of the challenges I think conservatives are going to have right now is they've successfully created a bunch of these centers, and they're now on a hiring spree. And really, there's only so many people out there that are high quality and mission aligned with those institutes to actually successfully hire. And so I think they have to be a little bit cautious that they can't simply be desperate to fill slots, because they're going to wind up hiring people who either are not going to be doing the kind of work that the centers were created to do in the first place, or potentially they're going to be subpar academics, and they're going to give the centers a bad reputation over time.
Well, I sort of can't wrap up without asking you just about this year on campus. And maybe it's not directly the focus of your book, but largely around the protests connected to Israel's war, the Israeli war in Gaza. Lots of First Amendment concerns, both with respect to students and the faculty. I think academia, particularly our prestige universities, took a real beating in the public perception. Any just takeaways from this year, and what we've learned about free speech on campus, and the academics, the commitment of the academy to free inquiry and responsible citizenship, which may be in tension sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely intention sometimes. I think we learn that universities have some real problems, in part, that have festered and created some of the difficulties that we're seeing. I think we have learned that the fall is going to be a mess as well, and I hope the universities are making plans over the course of the summer as to how to better handle some of these kind of protest activities, because they're undoubtedly going to occur in the fall semester. I think universities have partially dug their own holes on this, and that they have not been very even-handed about actually enforcing the rules. Even if universities have pretty good and neutral time, place, and manner regulations in place, they have not been good about communicating them. They've not been good about enforcing them in a consistent fashion. Lots of students expected they would not be enforced in practice, and that emboldened students to violate them routinely, which made it particularly hard for universities to try to take them more seriously this past fall, and breaking out of that cycle, so that people actually understand there actually are some rules here, and the university is actually going to try to enforce them, is going to be tough, but I think a necessary task that universities absolutely have to engage in. Universities, I think, have to be insistent that they're going to protect genuine First Amendment and free expression activities. And so they're not going to punish people simply because they're engaged in speech people don't like, even very extreme speech. But they are going to discipline people for conduct that is disruptive to the university and interferes with the educational work of the university. And I think universities have to be clear about those distinctions and have to be willing to take action on those distinctions. But they haven't done a bang-up job so far. And unfortunately, I think the fall is going to test them some more on this front, because not only are we going to continue to have the Israeli Gaza type protest continuing into the fall semester, but now we're going to have campaign season, domestic election issues as well. They're likely to create their own challenges on campus.
Thank you. We do need to wrap up soon. I got a couple other questions, and I can fold them up together, perhaps. We did talk a lot about academic freedom on public university campuses. Just quickly, how are things playing out in non-public universities? Can the government, or are any governments trying to pressure what's taught there through funding or other mechanisms? And can they, or are the trustees doing something similar? Probably different questions if it's coming from the employer versus the state.
Yeah.
And at the other end, K through 12, does the government largely have a free hand in shaping what curriculum looks like?
Yeah, so I think the K through 12 is the easiest, and that the government does have a pretty free hand there. And of course, the government can make good and bad decisions about what the content looks like. But traditionally, the government's not been understood to have quite a free hand in how it designs those curriculums, what happens in those classroom contexts, not least because you're dealing with children. In that context, and because the nature of the educational enterprise at the K through 12 level is understood to be quite different than the kind of educational enterprise the universities are trying to engage in. I think quite appropriately, the legal challenges to some of the Stop Act type of legislation that's been applied to K through 12 has focused much more on due process concerns. Do teachers have enough notice about what actually the prohibited speech is, rather than a true First Amendment concern? Are there things the government simply can't tell teachers they can't say in a K through 12 context? Relative to private universities, I think there are lots of academic freedom challenges at private universities, unfortunately. We have not seen yet the same kinds of governmental challenges to the academic freedom sphere, but one of the hooks for doing it is clearly through strings attached to grants. Private universities take a tremendous amount of money from governments through various kinds of mechanisms, and one way in which governments can influence what happens in private universities is by attaching strings to grants in various ways. I wouldn't be surprised if Republican-leaning governments in particular wind up trying to deploy that more aggressively in the future. There are some real constitutional constraints there as well, and that's going to be tested over time, depending on what the details look like. Meanwhile, private universities themselves have not always been great about protecting private universities. There's threats from outside players, whether it's donors or political activists who want to put pressure on private universities to restrict speech. But unfortunately, there's also lots of internal pressure in private universities as well to restrict speech on campus. There are people on campus who don't like what other people on campus are saying and doing, and want to punish people for that speech. And that includes speech that professors engage in those private universities. And so I would hope that people would recognize that some of these challenges that public universities are facing from the political right should lead them to think more carefully about their own principles and adhere to them more strictly and consistently in the private university context. But so far, I think people have not always gotten that message. Important to think through what those principles are, recognize why we have these kinds of commitments, and then adhere to them in an even-handed and principled way in a consistent fashion in both private universities and public universities. And we'd be much better off if we could do that. But unfortunately, we're not there yet.
That is a fantastic way to wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much, Keith. Professor Keith Whittington is the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School, which I understand is a good law school.
I'm told it is, yeah, and it's even better now.
And we're very, very happy to have him today. Thank you so much, Keith. Just a reminder to everybody, we are a membership organization. You could become a member on our website. You could sign our statement of principles. And I hope you can join us in person in DC in November for our summit. There should be a lot to talk about the rule of law and the Constitution after the election. Don't forget to buy Keith's book, You Can't Teach That. It is available on Amazon and other platforms. And exciting to me, and I think a lot of the members of the Society for the Rule of Law, he has another book coming out in November about the impeachment power, which I think I know you can pre-order it on Amazon because I have already done so. I encourage others to do that as well. I look forward to that showing up in the mail this fall, and perhaps we could have Keith back to talk about that later this year. Thank you so much, Professor Whittington, and thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon and the rest of the summer.
Thanks.